Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Let's Be Frank, the men's mental health podcast. In a world where open discussions about mental health are vital, we bring you a safe space to explore and address the unique challenges faced by men. This podcast delves deep into the complexities of men's mental health, aiming to break down stigmas, provide support, and ignite meaningful conversations. Our mission is to empower men to embrace vulnerability, seek help when needed, and prioritize their mental well-being. Each episode of Let's Be Frank features insightful interviews with experts, personal stories from brave individuals, and thought-provoking discussions on various topics, including relationships, work-life balance, masculinity, and self-care. We believe by shedding light on these critical issues, we can foster a community that fosters empathy, understanding, and growth. Join us as we navigate the complexities of men's mental health with compassion, empathy, and a commitment to destigmatizing the conversation. Whether you're a man looking for guidance, a loved one seeking a better understanding than men in your life, or simply an advocate for mental health, this podcast is for you. So join us and let's embark on this transformative journey together. Get ready to be inspired, educated, and empowered. Welcome to Let's Be Frank, the home of men's mental health. Let's break down barriers, shatter stigmas, and redefine what it means to be a man in today's world. Guys, welcome back to the Let's Be Frank podcast, the home of men's mental health. Today we have a special guest who is taking the comedy steam by storm. Fresh off a sold-out debut at the Edinburgh Fringe and earning an Amused Moose Best Show nomination, our guest brings a quirky and offbeat style to tonight's show. After attending 4 weddings from different generations, he unraveled the mysteries behind his own breakdown a decade ago. Exploring male mental health in older millennials influenced by societal values and the impact of the internet, he poses the question: did the internet make us or break us? Our guest comedy career is skyrocketing with award nominations, comedy competitions, finals, and appearances on BBC Radio 4. Not to mention his own TikTok videos are going absolutely viral with millions of views. Get ready for laughter and an open, frank conversation as we welcome the hilarious and thought-provoking Phil Green to the podcast. Phil, welcome, mate. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
taking the
So
time
it's
to
an
come speak to
introduction
us.
that has a lot of pressure to be funny, but thank you very much.
No, mate, it's an absolute pleasure. And obviously tonight we've got the one and only, as always, Mr. Ryan Smith. Mate, how we diddling
Do you know
this
what?
evening,
I'm
mate?
actually nervous on this one. The only reason I say that, people just tune in to listen to us, and we'll crack a few jokes, but we're no longer funny compared to this man, are we? So
Let's see how it goes.
let's see how it goes. So I must have
The thing
just
is, we try and crack a joke and it never works. So Phil is just naturally funny, hence why the career path he's now got. Um, but well, kind of the first question I'm probably going to throw at you, Phil, if that's right. It's like, how and what made you go
Yeah,
into
so
comedy?
I, I'd sort of always been a comedy nerd when I was from a young kid. My dad was really into comedy, so he liked things like Forty Towers and a bit of Monty Python and that sort of stuff. So I watched and like even going back to like Tony Hancock, like really really old stuff. So we had loads of like videos and tapes when I was young, and I used to listen to that stuff. But I never really had the kind of the balls to do it. I didn't really feel very confident in actually doing it, and I didn't go to the sort of school where anything creative was particularly encouraged. So I didn't really feel like it was something that was necessarily a career for me or something I was ever going to go into. I thought that was for like art school kids. And I did a bit of radio stuff. I did a bit of radio stuff as a student, and then also I did a bit of local radio stuff. So I was able to sort of try and be a little bit funny then, do some little skits with a guy I used to present a show with. But it wasn't until I was sort of in my mid-30s, and one of my best friends split up with his long-term girlfriend, and he was in a bad place. And he suggested doing a comedy course to take his mind off things, and he'd been on at me for years about doing a comedy course together. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll do it with him, just to kind of like support him through this. And that was a sort of a 6-week course, and it culminated in a showcase performance at a backyard comedy club in Bethnal Green, which is a big comedy club. And it went really well. It went really well for both of us. And then so I kind of had the bug at that point. I thought it felt really good being on stage and talking about yourself and getting a response from an audience and feeling like people connecting with what you're saying. So I then we both went on to do the second gig, and that didn't go so well. And my friend quit after the second gig, but I still had that bug, and so I carried on gigging, and now I'm here, sort of 6 years later, 7 years later, still doing this. So yeah, it was I suppose on some kind of subconscious level, it was something I'd always wanted to do, but I think it took something like that to happen for me to actually have the confidence to do it. So yeah, that's the sort of my route in. I mean, everyone's got sort of different routes into comedy whenever you speak to different comedians. But yeah, that was my access point, I suppose.
You find quite a lot of comedians kind of pick it up later on in life. Do you think that is better in a sense that you've now got like a life story to bring into your act and make a show from as such, or would you push people that are kind of young coming out of school that have got a bug for it to go straight into it? What would be your kind of
Yeah, I think
advice or
it
route?
depends on the level of self-awareness. So I don't feel like when I was in my 20s, I was probably anywhere near self-aware enough to be able to do it, because I think you do have to have quite a high level of self-awareness. That said, I think actually doing comedy in itself brings about quite a heavy level of self-awareness, because you're forced to self-reflect all the time, and you're forced to self-reflect on all of the decisions that you made in life, all of your relationships, your family, and and sort of for want of a better term, mine your trauma, really, for your act. So I don't know if it necessarily would have been beneficial for me to get into it young, but I would say actually, if and there are quite a lot of comedians these days that do start quite young. So I think you're right. Generally, historically, it's been people who are a little bit older and have a little bit of life experience. And for me, I think that did help, because I had years to look back on and sort of look at all my decision making and think about what I did right and what I did wrong, and sort of mind that. But I think if you feel confident and you feel like you've got a story to tell, I don't think it matters what age you are. Just get up and do it, and the audience will tell you pretty soon whether or not they're interested in what you've got to say. But yeah, I definitely think there's I think I always encourage anyone at any age, and I love seeing people even in their their 50s and 60s. I've even met people in their 70s who start comedy then, and I think that's brilliant. It's brilliant. Whatever story you've got to tell, get on stage and tell it. And I think if there's an audience for you, then you're a comedian. That's the reality of it. But for me, I think it was always going to be something that it took like something like that for me to get into it. But I guess as a result of that, you're absolutely right. I've got sort of 25 years worth of stories to look back on that I can kind of bring onto the stage.
Yeah, so there's so much stuff in there, and obviously we were just talking a bit off air about my sort of short stint. It was only, I think it was about 6-7 months.
Your attempt.
I think I did
good.
about 8 shows, in that short time there, and you're talking about like
Doing shows to your parents don't count, Ryan. We've spoke about
right,
this.
but yeah, so you're talking about life experiences and stuff like that. Now, I remember one of the things that I closed on was being pulled over by a police officer for drink driving. Some of it is better than the truth. I wasn't drink driving and stuff like that, but there was a swan involved and some feathers involved and stuff like that.
Okay.
You'd say, I mean, yeah, and it's like you say, there's certain moments through when you're telling stories and stuff, you're going to grip people and stuff like that. What goes through your head when you start losing audiences and stuff? Because I know when I've done it in the past, I was like, oh, this is just falling on deaf ears, and I'm just like, drop mic, see you later, type thing. And obviously, how would you?
Well,
how do you
early
approach
on,
stuff like
when
that?
you don't have a lot of material, because I mean, you'll probably know, Ryan, just from doing a few gigs, you've only really got 5 minutes of material when you first start, not really much more than that, and probably some of it's going to be quite ropey. So when that happens early on, you just have to kind of plow through the set and get to the end, because you don't really have anything else to fall back on. But when you've been going a few years, you do have a lot more material. So often, if you feel like, well, for me personally, if I feel like I'm losing the audience, or they're not engaged with what I'm saying, I can kind of switch tack and maybe just switch onto a different subject or go down a different route with it. It doesn't happen that often, but it does definitely happen. But I think that's just comes from, the more experience I have with that, the more I'm able to kind of read the room better. But definitely early on, you're so focused on just getting the material out that you're not really obviously you are looking at the reaction of the room, but you don't really, your mind isn't in a place where it can easily switch direction. But the more comfortable, I find the more comfortable that you get on stage, the easier it is to do that. So it's just responding to how the room's reacting to what you're saying. But it definitely helps the more material you've got to be able to switch to that.
So, I mean, I'm still in contact with a lot of people that I've done stuff with. I mean, I'm not going to name drop on here or anything because it's not about them. But I mean, something that I find as well, and dealing with my own sort of mental health and things like that, do you find that a lot of people on the sort of comedy circuit, not just the comedy circuit, but in some form of entertainment, battle with the demons and stuff, that are dealing with the mental health and stuff like that? Do you find it's an outlet for them? Do is it an outlet
Sure,
for yourself?
for sure. I think I mean that there's a sort of fairly classic joke that you'll hear a lot of comedians make, that comedians do comedy because it's cheaper than therapy, and there is a level of truth in that for sure, because you are, a lot of comedians are addressing their demons, and as I mentioned earlier, you are looking back and you are reflecting, and you're mining trauma, and there is something therapeutic about being able to go out in front of a room full of strangers and be able to just talk about those issues. And in some cases, it's stuff you've never talked about with your friends or your family before. But yet suddenly you go out and you tell 50 people in a room above a pub. It seems like a strange thing to do. But I think that's one of the reasons why comedians get the bug quite quickly, because they feel, suddenly it's something that people are listening to me and my story. And if you feel the audience are connecting with what you're saying, then that in itself is quite addictive, and you want more of that, I think. And so my feeling is the more open you can be, the more you're going to connect with the audience, the better reaction you're going to get from the audience, and the more relatable it becomes to them. The danger can be, and I've seen this with quite a few comedians, is that it ends up, they think that comedy in itself couldn't solve the problem, and it won't, because yes, you are airing your your frustrations in life, and you are talking about difficult times and traumas and all those sort of things, but that's not necessarily, it is just simply that, it's airing it, it is talking about it. But I think it's a one-way conversation, that you're just telling the audience how you feel about it. There's no one there sort of asking you questions, if you know what I mean. They're not challenging what you're saying, or they're not kind of questioning what's necessarily behind all of that. So whilst I do think it's a good thing, and I think it can be therapeutic, I don't think it necessarily replaces or should replace therapy, if that is what you need.
Yeah, we're in. I'd have to say I'm definitely in agreement with you there with regards to the therapy aspect, and you can probably see it. I think there'll be a lot of people listening to this that have gone to a comedy show, and that that sort of material of mental health will be brought up, and you could see people's reaction. Like you could see the comedian's face when the facial expressions when they say certain jokes. You can see that joke will mean a bit more to them than something else. Like we can all kind of read certain signs. As you say, therapy isn't, or comedy isn't, a replacement for that. And is therapy something that yourself has been through? Have
Yeah,
you
so
tried
I have,
therapy?
and it
What's
was.
your
I
experience
mean,
with that?
I've had some since I started comedy, but actually most of it was before I started doing comedy, probably about 5 years before, really. Which was, I went through quite a turbulent period back in sort of 2010, 2011, losing a couple of close family members at the time. Our relationship was falling apart, and my best friend got cancer, and all kind of came together at the same time. And it did, I kind of started shutting down, and I wasn't functioning, and I wasn't effective at work. I wasn't able to sleep for a long time. I was having panic attacks, and up until that point in my life, and that was my late 20s, early 30s, I think I'd already experienced quite high levels of anxiety, but hadn't acknowledged that that was what I was actually feeling. I didn't know it was anxiety. It just felt normal to me. But then that escalated into panic attacks around that time, and I mean daily panic attacks and frequent panic attacks. And I think that those events coming together were just triggering a reaction in me, which was about, well, hang on, what are you doing with your life? Is this job or is this relationship what you want? Are you living where you want to live? Is this what you thought you were going to be? Is this what you thought you wanted your life to be? And but at the time, I genuinely thought that, I didn't think it was that. I thought I had a heart condition. I thought I was ill. I thought there was something physically wrong with me. And I went and had a load of tests I went to the GP, and the GP referred me, and I had a load of tests on my heart and all that sort of stuff. And eventually we did all these tests, and I came back to the GP and he said, well, there's nothing wrong with you physically. So what's going on in your life? And then I was talking about the events I've just mentioned. He said, well, this is psychological. That's the most likely thing. So he referred me to get CBT. And that was the first time, to be honest, I'd ever really heard about CBT or knew much about CBT. And that was hugely helpful. I had to go through a couple of CBT therapists to find somebody that I connected with. But once I did, I had a course of I think it was about 10 sessions with CBT therapy, and that really helped me to get the panic attacks under control and be able to function properly. And then following that, I then had I don't really know what the term is, but I call it more traditional therapy. I'm sure you correct me on that, but therapy where it's more about going into the roots of the problem and looking at why I got to that point, really. And that probably for me was life changing. That really was the thing that made me realize that the path I was on in life just wasn't right for me. There wasn't necessarily anything wrong with the path, i.e. there's nothing wrong with the job that I was doing or the relationship that I was in specifically. It just wasn't right for me. And it was coming to that realization that made me change things in my life, really. So getting to, I guess I did come out of that relationship, and I did step off the career ladder that I was on, and I started to pursue other things. That's when I started doing the radio stuff that I mentioned earlier. But I was looking for something creative. I was looking for something that suited what I wanted, what felt right for me. And so although I sort of eventually got into comedy accidentally, it was certainly the instinctive feeling of, oh, this feels right. This actually feels like the right, a good career choice or the right job for me. And whereas previously I think I've been trying to kind of fill what I thought was a socially expected demand of me, I suppose, from the environment that I grew up in, which I think actually mostly was in my head, but I believe that was what I was supposed to be doing. So the therapy, like 2 bouts of therapy really helped me enormously, I suppose, firstly to get under control the way I was feeling at the time, but then secondly to understand why it had happened. And then I think my feeling is that once you understand the reasons behind it, you can start to make changes in your life, because then you can start to look at where you went wrong, maybe, or wrongs. I don't know if wrong's the right term to use, but where you made those decisions and why you made those decisions, and then start making decisions that feel right for you, that aren't about what anyone else expects of you, but just that feel right for you.
Yeah, no, it's powerful. Like when you mentioned there about having to kind of find the right therapist for you, like I think me and Ryan are both in agreement that it took us a very long time to find the right therapist. I think I've been to 6 or 7, and I've only had 2 that I've had a connection with that I could talk with and get some feedback back to myself and just feel comfortable in opening up. And it is hard, and it doesn't, as I say, anyone that's listening and is starting therapy or thinking they're going to therapy, like, just be aware that you may well have to find 2, 3, 4 therapists for you to really find that connection.
Takes work.
I want to come back to yeah, it does
It
take
takes
work,
work in
and
itself.
I want to come back to your question real quick. Was there one defining moment or scenario that happened back at that time when all the panic attacks happened? What was there one defining moment that you kind of said to yourself, like, right, something's not right here, something is wrong, or is there one that stands out the most?
Yeah, I don't know if there was one. There was probably a few. Certainly that conversation with the GP following those tests, and the GP actually telling me there's nothing, like physically there was nothing wrong with you. You don't have a heart condition. You are not going to die. And I'd gone through probably 6 or 8 months of genuinely believing on a daily basis that I was going to die. Um, I think that was refreshing, and I think on a subconscious level, I did know that. On a subconscious level, there was something in my brain telling me, this is crazy. This is not what you think it is. You need to look at it. Stop looking at this. This is the problem. But I kind of needed to go through that and have the proof, the written proof in front of me, if you like, that it's not this. So this is psychological, and you need to start talking to people. So that was a moment. But there was definitely a point. I remember going into. I had a career in IT, and it was going all right. It was going like I'd had a couple of promotions on the bounce, and if you look at that from the outside, you'd say, well, he's fine, he's doing well, his career's going all right. And I remember going into my after the second promotion, I got two promotions in the space of about 2 years. I got taken into my boss's office. He was like the head of IT at the time or something like that. And he said, and I remember him sitting down with me, just a one-to-one, and it was very much like a David Brent moment. And he sort of sat there and he went, Phil, it's going, this is going good. We're really pleased with your progress. And he genuinely said these words. He said, he said, I think if you carry on the tracks you're on, I think in 5 years' time you could be sitting in this chair. And he meant that. He meant that as a compliment. He meant, yeah, exactly.
We've all had that. We've all had that, haven't we? I've had that
I've
and
not.
all.
Which he
You're in the
obviously
wrong
meant
job.
that as an encouraging thing. And I walked out of that meeting thinking, fuck, is that where my life is heading, to be sort of head of IT for an insurance company? It wasn't, at no point in my childhood had I ever thought that's what I wanted to achieve. Yeah, exactly.
Made it!
And
Made it!
yeah, I've done it. You're going to be so
Mum,
proud.
Dad, I've done
Get this
it.
next to the school certificate. But I honestly, I don't. And I, in no way am I sort of slagging off anyone who if that's what you want in your career, that's brilliant. And if you're on that track and you that's what you aspire to be, that's terrific. But the fact that it made me, I walked out of that meeting sort of in pieces, thinking, Jesus, that was a moment where you can either think, okay, well, I need to rethink what I'm doing in life, or you can just carry on in the same direction and hope that that next promotion is going to make things better, or you're going to get there in 5 years and suddenly it's going to solve all your problems. But the reality is, if that's the reaction that you have at that point, it's not gonna, you've got to reassess, I think, which is easier said than done. And no way am I saying that is easy, but I think those two moments for me were probably defining in terms of making any kind of significant change in life.
Yeah, I mean, there are, there's some really key things in there. Has there been any sort of times where you thought, I see no way out of this? There was that, you've had them realizations there, and with things like your heart and stuff like that. I mean, it was a sort of a different thing for me and stuff. Mine was my brain and whatnot. But has there ever been times where you've thought to yourself, there is no way out of this?
Probably not consciously, because I was following a kind of, I guess, a life path that I felt had been drummed into me by the environment. I grew up in a very safe middle class environment, and I think a lot of the reason that it took me sort of, to my late 20s, early 30s to make any significant changes, because I didn't feel that somebody like me that had I mean, I'm not saying I didn't go to a posh school, or my parents weren't exactly rich, but equally we were just fine. It was a very safe, upbringing, and everything was fine. I didn't have any sort of serious trauma as a child, so I kind of felt like, well, I should be grateful for the life that I have, and I didn't feel like I should feel the right to feel anxious or be in this position. And I think that's kind of why I thought this must be physical, because I thought, well, I'd look at my life and think, well, I've got a good job, I've got a good relationship, I've got a flat, life life should be good, but yet I wasn't feeling that in on the inside. But so I'm looking for other reasons. So I think I did feel trapped on a subconscious level, but I trapped myself. I put myself in that position, and so I wasn't looking for a way out at that point, because my thought process was probably, oh well, I'll just get the next promotion, or and then we'll buy a bigger flat, and we'll I don't know, we'll have that next holiday, or we'll have kids, or whatever the next thing is, the next life milestone that was going to somehow solve the problem. And obviously it isn't, because none of the path that you're on is the problem, if that's how you're feeling. So it it's I guess having that jolt to sort of stop and look around you and look at the paths available to you, and wonder if and think about whether the one that you're on is the right one for you.
Yeah, and I think I think what you're saying, there will be a lot of people out there that will be able to take something from, it's one of the societal sort of expectations of men, so to speak. You've got to provide, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and there's a really common saying where there's always somebody worse off. And it's like exactly what you're saying. So if there is always somebody worse off, that kind of subconsciously makes me feel like, well, my problems aren't that significant then, so I need to keep them to myself. And this is where we're trying to break that sort of that stigma around that saying, well, yes, there is somebody worse off, but they're not my problems. My problems are real to me. And this is where it needs to be aired and spoke about and stuff like that. So, I'm from what I'm gathering, you was in
Yeah,
that sort of
absolutely,
spiral
very
yourself.
much. And it might sound a bit odd to say, but I'm sort of glad that, obviously, I'm not glad I lost people in my life, and um, I'm not glad about everything that happened, particularly in terms of the events. But what I am kind of glad about is that there was a jolt to do something about it, if you know what I mean. That because I sometimes see, and I do see this in peers, people around me of similar age, is that I do see quite a lot of men going through a similar thing, and often some don't acknowledge it and just keep on going down the same path. And I worry a lot about those friends and those people that I see doing that. But sometimes those that do go and get help will only do that to the point where they're suddenly feeling okay again. So maybe they get signed off work for a bit, and they have a bit of therapy, or maybe they have a bit of medication to help bring their anxiety under control. And as soon as they feel fine about themselves again, they just go back on exactly the same path they were on before. They don't change anything, so it kind of delay. All you're doing is kind of kicking the can down the road a bit. The problem's going to come back at some point, because you're not fundamentally changing or addressing everything in life. And in no way am I saying you have to change everything in your life, because not everything is necessarily wrong. But I think it's important to identify why you've got to that point. So yeah, I think I had to spiral to that real low in order for it to kick me into action to do something, I think. And I don't in no way do I want to see people get to that low. I'd rather people address it earlier. And I do think probably for younger generations, I think that probably is the case more, I think, because I think that from what I see, and certainly from being friends with a lot of younger comedians, there's much more healthy discussion about mental health at a much younger age, which is great, because you are acknowledging problems and addressing issues, and as you're going through them. Whereas I'm sort of doing that retrospectively, and a lot of men, I think, around my age and are doing the same thing.
It's definitely a couple of things really. So with regards to like the ages, I would say that definitely the likes of people in their 30s and above have got this old school mentality of it. The younger generation are now picking up on this, and they, as you say, they are having them discussions. More needs to be done with the younger generation. Myself and Ryan feel that it's definitely something that needs to be spoken about more and showcased. And I had a conversation with one of my customers for my day-to-day job about his son, and we spent an hour and a half talking about his son's current like mental health issues he's having, and that conversation really sparked something different in me than what I thought it would have. And it's starting to push me down a new career path and a different route that I would say I'm better suited for. The same as when obviously the comedy come to you. Was looking back on your path you've had, the mental health, the panic attacks, everything like that. I get asked this a lot. Would you ever go back and change any of it? Would you go back if someone said to you, you can go and restart your life again tomorrow, back at being 18, 19, whatever? Would you go and do it, or would you lead the same life to then get where you are now?
Good question. um, uh, yeah, you have, yeah. I
We've
think
stunned him, Ryan. We've done
that
it.
what I would probably want to do is go back and I suppose tell my younger self that do you know that you like to stop and think at each kind of crossroads in life. That's probably what the advice I would give. So I wouldn't necessarily know what the change would have been at that point, but what I would have probably done is say, when you get to a crossroads in life, a decision point, don't just carry on the same road just because you're on that road. Just stop and look at the options around you. Look at the different paths you can take. And if you want to go down one path, that's fine. But if it doesn't feel right, and if you feel anxious, if you don't feel, if you feel something feels instinctively wrong, stop and go back and look at the other options, look at the other paths you can take, and maybe try a different route. And I think it's the trial and error thing. I think that I didn't have a lot of that. I was just carrying on doing the same kind of socially constructed path that most of my peers were taking, that I thought I should be taking, because that's what was expected of me. Even though I think that expectation actually is mostly in my head. I think it is for a lot of people. So I think that's what I would change. I wouldn't necessarily say go back and tell my 20-something self, go and do this instead. What I would say is, when you get to this point, stop and think about what you want to do. Because maybe there might have been things that I didn't try then that would have been better for me at that time that I don't know. I don't even know now, but that would be the biggest piece of advice I could have given my younger self. So I don't know if, yeah, it's difficult to say, isn't it? because I've ended up in a yeah, I've ended up
Stumped him, mate. We've stumped him.
in a happy place now. I'm happy with where my life is now, and don't get me wrong, I'm always consciously aware that I need to be thinking about what I'm doing, and if again, like, learn that lesson, something feels wrong, to change it. But I suppose that it is the decisions that you make that get you to this point. But it would have been nice to have that awareness, I think, at a younger age. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does go to show, that there's stuff that happened to me growing up, and especially later on in life, that I look back now and I think, do you know what, it was tough, but I wouldn't change any of it, because it's made me that sort of person that I am today. Now, I really appreciate sharing that, so, and it does show, taking value from the lessons that you've had. But I want to move on now, and I want to actually talk about your up and coming show. I want to talk about why the title, your experiences around it. So that's where I want to go now. So why
I
why
changed
the
the
title?
title, actually. The original title was called Millennial Bug: The Unbearable Weight of Social Expectation. And yeah, and I know, yeah, isn't it? I know. Yeah, part of it was
That's a
a compliment on the
mouthful, that one.
process, so I didn't have to change it
Shorten
anyway. But I think it was always about social expectation. It was always about growing up with a similar, or what was ingrained into me as a sort of, like, I say older millennial or young Gen X. I don't really quite know where I sit, but somewhere in that bracket. Brought up by baby boomer parents, with the same philosophy installed in me that their parents would have given to them, which is fine, and I understand why that philosophy was there. But obviously, we as a generation had a lot of options that our parents didn't, and a lot of that was fueled by the internet. So I think that the show is really it's quite specifically about that this generation, but I do touch on how different that is from my baby boom parents, and what their philosophy was, and to some extent still is, and contrasting that to Gen Z. And I think that the thing that kind of brought that home to me was going to these different weddings and seeing how different generations, and talking to the people in the weddings, talking to the guests at the weddings, and it's so different, the philosophy of those couples and those generations have on life generally, and that's kind of what made me piece together, I suppose, the reasons why I had a breakdown, or I got to that point. I got to that point where I'd sunk to that low, because I realised it was the generational influences of my baby boom parents that were contrasting with much more modern generational influences and the choices that we have. So that's kind of where the title came from. It was literally those experiences and talking to those different generations at those weddings, and not just weddings, actually, not just in life generally. That I got to that point, really. And I was a bit unsure as to whether or not to put breakdown in the title, because it is quite a heavy word to use, and it isn't you know, I talk about it, but I talk about it in a light-hearted way. But the reason I do that is because I want people I want to try and get, yeah, exactly, yeah, to laugh. Ideally, but also to, you know, you can make people laugh, but you could also talk about something that has and is affecting probably a fair few people in the audience. Then I think that's a good thing, and it goes a little bit beyond just entertaining people. So yeah, that's kind of how the title came about, really. And I did my first hour show last year, and I touched a little bit on mental health in that show. Not loads. It was more of a kind of it was all about the 90s. It was more like a kind of fun, kind of wacky kind of show. But I did touch a little bit on 90s attitudes to mental health, and I noticed that seemed to resonate a lot with audiences, particularly of my people around my age. So I thought, well, there's something in this, and that's kind of what made me kind of want to explore that a little bit further. And the more that I started to do that, as I was building the show out and doing it to new audiences, the more people were coming up to me afterwards and saying that those were the bits they really enjoyed, and they could relate to that. So I felt there was something in it, and that's how it came about, really.
It's like you said at the beginning, where you're building that kind of connection with the audience. You've picked something that they can relate to, and if they can relate to it, then they're more willing to be engaged in that kind of conversation, and that's what you've done an incredible job at. And what's your going forward with your new show? What's your expectations for this show, and kind of your career moving forward? What is it you would personally like to see?
I'd like, you know, it's going to do a run in Edinburgh, and what I'd like to see is people of all generations coming to see it. Although it is specifically talking about my experience, and therefore I think it will resonate particularly with probably particularly with men of my age. Yeah, exactly. Ryan's pointing himself. But I would like to see, you know, and I had I did a show on Saturday to a much older crowd, mostly baby boomers, and it's interesting to see the different reactions with them. You know, it was really interesting because they're reflecting on the way that they have, or the philosophy that they were brought up in, compared to the philosophy that they maybe installed in their kids, or maybe have tried not to install in their kids. I don't know, but it's so I'd like it to kind of have that wider appeal, and similarly, I'd like to, it'd be nice to see younger people coming along to it as well. I did start to get that in my last show run, that there were sort of quite a lot of under 25s coming along, and I'm interested in their perspective on it as well. Can they see this in their parents? Can they see this in people around them? And how does what I'm talking about differ from their experience of mental health, or their own, or their decision making in life? What's influencing their decision making in life, which is going to be very different to what influenced my decision making, and probably, I'm sure, your decision making at a similar age. So yeah, that's my hope for it, that it's able to attract people of all generations, and that it will inform my perspective even further. So that, because I'd like to continue to talk about this a little bit more post the Edinburgh run.
So I'll just a little. It's not off subject, but was it early 80s, mid 80s, end of the 80s?
Early 80s, right at the beginning of the 80s.
You were born.
Yeah.
Early 80s, right? Okay, so I'm mid 80s. I don't think Jack was even thought of
It was an idea,
like
it
the
was a
80s. So,
Hey, I was probably left in a sock somewhere, mate, at that point. So I won't worry about it. I'm very early 90s,
yeah.
mate. I'm early 90s.
So I actually put myself as Gen X rather than millennial.
Yeah.
So that's where I look at myself. But yeah, last generation of common sense.
I just see myself as a person. I don't understand all this Gen X and millennial malarkey. Do you know what I mean? I'm a very simple person, as you may have already gathered. That I'm just a bloke. That's the way I see
Jack's
it.
the sort of person
But
that would.
where can people come and?
Sorry, I
Go on,
was
Ryan.
just about to say that Jack's the sort of person
Go
that
on,
walk through the
stitch
door
me
and
up.
dragging his knuckles. That's Jack.
Yeah, proper door kicker. But where can people come and find your show or come and see your
so the
upcoming
Edinburgh
show?
run starts on the 5th of August. It runs to the 27th. It's at 2:40 in the Banshee Labyrinth in Edinburgh. It's right in the middle of Edinburgh. And it's what they call a pay what you can. So you can just turn up on the day, get there an hour before, and they release the tickets. But I'm doing some previews before that, so I'll be going to there's a few London dates, also Durham, Newcastle, Norwich, and a few other places as well. So if you go on to my
Any Nottingham?
not Nottingham, no.
What? See, I would have. I see that would have been an ideal time for me to come
Buxton,
along.
which is probably about as close as I was going to get. So,
oh wow, yeah. It's still a million miles away.
So no, sorry about that. But I'm hoping that it will have a life after Edinburgh as well. So if it has a good run, then I'd like to take it. Certainly have a run in London, but probably a few dates around the country as well, which happened with the show last year. That'd be lovely if I can. So, but yeah, if you go onto my social media channels, which is at Phil Green Comedy, then I post dates about that on there, and there's a link there to all of my show dates. So you can go in there and find it there.
Fantastic. It's
absolutely spot on. And guys, we will put all the links in the description as well
absolutely.
for you guys to find nice and easy, and take over to Phil's page, because I'm definitely going to be sorting out a road trip, because I need to come and see you.
It would be good. It would be good.
Please keep us updated. And I think me and Ryan need a day away from the other halves and that. So we're going to do a little road trip and come and see it. Definitely,
I need a
100%.
day away from you. Never mind the other half.
Hey, don't you start now.
Come on, States, guys. That's fine.
Yeah, we'll do that. It sounds good to me. It sounds good.
Absolutely. It's any sort of final thoughts for any, for yourself, mental health, or any budding comedians out there? Just Phil's thoughts.
Final thoughts.
Final
like
thoughts.
Jerry Springer. Certainly for it probably sounds like I'm sort of saying get into comedy to deal with your issue. I don't think that's like I said, I don't think that is the answer. Yeah, but
didn't work for me.
But I do think if you are somebody who is a creative, and you aren't in an environment through no fault of anyone particularly, but maybe the school you're in, or the environment you're where you're able to maybe exhibit that, then try and, I think as much as possible, try and get yourself into that, because I do think that if you kind of if somebody is a creative and they sort of stifle their ability, or they are stifling their own ability, that's not a great thing, because if you've got that in you, you need that outlet. And I think whatever it is, whether it's music or art or comedy, then I always encourage people to try and explore that. Anyone like yourself, Ryan, anyone who says to me, "Oh, I'd like to give stand-up comedy," I always say, just do it. And so there was people on that course that I mentioned that I started off with, who weren't really doing it because they wanted to be stand-up comics. They were just doing it because they wanted that experience of what it's like to stand on stage and talk to people and build that confidence. And most of the people on that course are no longer doing stand-up. But I don't think I'm friends with a few of them still. I've never met anyone that's regretted trying it. So I always think, whatever it is, try it, because you're more likely to regret not trying than you are trying. So that's my only bit of my nugget of wisdom, if that helps anyone.
Absolutely. I think that goes for anything, though, doesn't it? If you are in a place where, it's like Jack looking at a career change. I'm looking at something totally different to where I am now. But it's, I think it goes for anything. If you know truly deep down that you're in the wrong direction, be brave. Don't leave yourself in a mess situation, but take that leap, because you'll only end up, God knows where, unhappy, and that's not what we want. So no, thank you very, very much, for sharing that, and thank you very much for coming on. It really is appreciated. Jack, anything from you?
Yeah, no, all I could say is thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come and chat to us, sharing your story, having that open and frank conversation. And I am 100% guaranteed all of our listeners across the globe are going to absolutely enjoy this episode.
No problem.
So again,
It's been really
thank
enjoyable.
you very much, mate. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so guys, that's been Phil Green, absolute gem of a bloke. But on that note, I'm going to end the show as I always end the show. Stand up, speak out, and always remember, use your voice.